Hi, I'm Frank Cabri, Vice President of Marketing here at Centrify, and welcome to another Centrify Chalk Talk. I'm joined here today by one of our Directors of Product Management, Corey Williams. Welcome, Corey.
Thank you.
As you know, we've recently at Centrify here done several Chalk Talks around virtualization, covered VMware and how we support a VMware environment, as well as Solaris operating systems. And the reality is we're seeing an increasingly heterogeneous environment in most data centers consisting of different operating systems, different hypervisor platforms, a mix of physical and virtual systems. And today we're going to focus really on the IBM Z-Series platform. And Corey, maybe that's a good place to start, just getting an understanding of the IBM Z-Series platform and how their environment looks.
Sure. Before I get up and draw that picture, I can just sort of say that some data points that we have around the IBM Z-Series platform. The mainframe itself has been around for quite a long time. In fact, the Series Z platform is now at Z10 level. It's been around for many, many years. A lot of the features and functionalities that it provides have become very mature and very important to very large organizations and enterprises.
Yep.
And as a matter of fact, over half of the companies that have mainframe from Series Z mainframe environments in their data center actually are starting to put Linux on those environments. We're seeing that as an increasing trend. I think IBM says that they have several thousand customers at this point that are running Linux on the mainframe environment, and they're selling the processors, which I'll describe here in a second, at a rate of about another couple thousand processors per year. And considering how many virtual environments you can run and the type of enterprise level features that the Series Z platform provides, that's quite an interesting market for us, and we're hearing a lot of demand from customers to be able to manage that environment, but also to manage it in the context that it's not their only Linux platform, and that they have other virtual environments like VMware and Unix, such as the Solaris one we talked about last time. I think David McNeely was talking about that.
Yeah.
As well as physical machines are still in the data center for Linux and Unix and Macs, and being able to manage all of those systems and secure them without having to go to each of the individual machines is basically the theme of what our product does and the value proposition that we're trying to bring to market.
Makes sense. So does it make sense to draw a little bit of that out?
Yeah, why don't I draw this picture and kind of describe what the Series Z platform looks like, and then we can use that to describe what some of the challenges are and how Centrify helps to address those.
Perfect, great.
So if we take a typical Series Z platform from IBM, the first thing that we notice is, and what we care about, is that there can be different types of CPUs or processors on it. The sort of one that most people are familiar with are these sort of general purpose processor units. And these would be used for typical mainframe workloads, the CIC, CICS, and other sort of storage and caching type of, and transactional type of solutions. And what they've introduced to, and you can actually run Linux on those systems as well, and I'll describe that. But IBM has actually also introduced a specific processor just for doing Linux workloads. And they actually refer to those as an IFL, which is an integrated facility for Linux. And IFLs provide specific environment just to run Linux workloads.
And I can mix and match on my Series Z platform these general purpose?
Right. So a typical Series Z platform might be an E40 or an Enterprise 40 class system. It would have 40 total processors, some of which would be general purpose, some of which would be IFLs. And they get managed in very similar ways. So I still can create a traditional partition on here, which they call an LPAR, or a logical partition, that lets me sort of describe how I want to allocate resources like processor and memory to a particular OS or workload. I can also run on top of these IFLs directly a virtualization hypervisor. They call it ZVM. This is an OS that allows me, it's very similar to ESX or to one of the Unix host environments that allows me then to run virtual machines on top of that. I may also run on top of these LPARs. I may also be running like the ZOS or other mainframe-specific OS that can then run your traditional workloads, which would be like CICS,
an inventory application, whatever.
The sort of the Z version of DB2 or other storage type of applications, and I might have multiple of these, right?
Yeah.
The ZVM OS allows me to actually spin up virtual machines running Linux. And they've validated on these Linux versions, they've actually validated like SUSE Linux from Novell, Red Hat Linux, and they've built those on this particular process type. Sometimes you hear these processor types as being the S390 or S390X processor type, much like I would say AMD or Intel or PowerPC, there's the S390. That's considered the sort of processor architecture that I'm compiling it to.
Okay.
And so these Linux environments have been imported. And on these Linux environments, I might be running, a web, Apache, MySQL. I might be running WebSphere. I could even be running something like SAP, running on top of like DB2 or Oracle. And that would be sort of a typical Linux workload that you would have on there.
Okay, so I've got my environment set up, I've got my platform, I'm starting to embrace virtualization on this platform. What are some of the challenges at a broad level that I need to be concerned about as this platform makes spinning up new systems very easy, right? So what are some of the challenges that people can expect?
Well, there's good things and bad things about running Linux workloads on a virtual environment like the Series Z. The first thing is that these Linux environments have actually been compiled and written to take advantage of certain mainframe class features, such as the ability to have a high-speed transport with other images that are not Linux. And I think IBM calls this the hypersocket interface. There's also storage interfaces for accessing, DASD and for being able to dynamically allocate more CPU or more memory without having to restart the environment. All that's been built in sort of the kernel layer of the Linux operating system. So it's done a good job of extending the Linux environment to take advantage of some of these really nice features in the Series Z platform, all of which lead to the benefit of being able to run hundreds or thousands of Linux workloads in literally a fraction of the space and power and cooling that you might have if you were using traditional sort of off-the-shelf Linux boxes in a rack. So that's the benefit of running these Linux workloads here. One of the challenges, however, is that when you run these Linux images in a virtual environment, whether it's the Series Z or it's VMware or it's the native Unix environments, like Zen platform or Sun's containers and zones, all of them lead to certain behaviors that end up proliferating the number of Linux images I might have. And I find that it's easier to manage one workload on one image rather than putting lots of different applications on the same image. So I'm going to have a lot more Linux images than I used to have. Mm-hmm. They're easier to spin up because now it's pressing buttons in a software interface or running commands at the command line, and I've got a new box. I don't have to go find a physical place to plug it in. All of that leads to great utilization of the resources, but it leads also to a proliferation of the boxes themselves. So now, instead of managing hundreds of servers with very heavy workloads and lots of applications on them, I'm now managing thousands of machines with much lighter weight processes being spread out across them. There's great benefits to that for the business and for the technology, but it becomes a challenge specifically for security and for users across those systems. So you asked me about what some of the challenges might be of looking at this environment. Well, for one, all of these individual Linux images need users to be able to log into them, to manage them, to be able to configure them, to be able to do the work, back them up, perform the work that needs to be done. And currently, the way that that's done is it's managed locally here in each individual box, right? I've got my Etsy password, I've got my local groups that I manage, the ACLs in the file system, and all of that has to be replicated across these individual servers. And that can be very challenging to do. You take that challenge and you combine it with the fact that it's not just the Series Z, it's also my Unix and my VMware and my Linux images that are running on physical machines. And now I've got not only an issue of my Series Z Linux images, but all these other images as well. And what we found with customers is that because of security or regulatory or audit policies and requirements, that users aren't allowed to have generic access. You can't just share the root password to 10,000 machines for all the administrators. What all these policies boil down to is that you need to be able to individually identify who the administrator is, so they don't use a shared account, they use an account that's signed specifically to them. You limit what they're allowed to do on any set of resources to just their job description. So if they're a backup operator, they can back up, but they can't go do queries in a database looking up financial information.
You explicitly state what they can do and can't do.
Yeah, we refer to that to roles and rights, right? What is their role and what rights does that role have? And then a lot of these policies also require to be able to recreate what they did on those boxes. So even though they're allowed to do certain functions, it may be that we need to understand exactly what they did, either for troubleshooting configuration problems, all the way to proving that they had malicious intent in using the privileges that they were granted. And so what Centrify does is we come in here and we actually install an agent on this box. And what we actually are able to do then is to join these individual Linux images, as well as the Unix and Linux images running in other virtual and physical environments, back to Active Directory. And Active Directory, the reason that we do that is because Active Directory is the enterprise repository that identifies all my individual users. So most of these images are managed from an individual machine, typically a Windows box, that I've logged into with my username and password, and then I'm remotely accessing these machines to administer them. And so being able to force people, we already force them to log into their desktop as themselves, being able to use that same identity to allow them to do their day-to-day functions allows me to then control who has access to which boxes, what they're allowed to do once they get on those boxes, and then finally to be able to recreate what they've done.
You mentioned earlier, Corey, that there's some native capabilities in the Linux operating system to do some of the roles and rights and other capabilities that you talked about. What unique capabilities above and beyond that is Centrify providing to this environment?
It's a good question. There's sort of two answers to it. One is that some of the main difference is that they're locally managed on each individual box. So as you get a lot of boxes, it becomes very difficult to be able to maintain the correct privileges on each of the individual boxes, because I have to log in and manage them, and somebody has to have root access to do that.
Right, so if I want to decline or restrict somebody from accessing a certain portion, I got to do it in instances of...
Yeah, so it becomes very cumbersome.
Yeah.
The other issue is that it can be slightly different how you manage that from operating system type to operating system type. So if you're running Unix or various flavors of Unix and Linux in your environments and different flavors of it, different versions of it, that becomes more knowledge that the administrators need to have. And what we found, Gartner did a survey where they actually found that half of the enterprises are completely heterogeneous. I mean, they had almost every flavor of Unix, Linux, mainframe actually running in their environments. So most of these enterprises are faced with a true heterogeneous problem. So it begs the question, would it be easier to have one central management tool with one skill set to be able to manage a lot of different platform types and a large number of them? But more specifically, we actually provide some additional functionality that isn't consistently found in all those different operating system types. So our base capability and product in the Centrify suite is called Direct Control. Direct Control is what allows me to join an image to Active Directory. It also enforces, in Active Directory, we have a feature called Zones. It allows us to actually define a group of machines that a user is allowed to access. And that provides sort of the first level of access control that you might want to have, so that a marketing department can have access to their machines, but not the engineering machines, is different from the data center administration machines and so forth. So I can actually partition up my enterprise, and I can do that without having to do any kind of extensions in Active Directory or without installing any software. I just leverage the environment that I already have. The other thing that the zones provide is the ability to apply group policy to these machines. So very much like I enforce certain policies on my desktops that individuals have, I can now enforce common configuration like the OpenSSH policy or the login policy or so forth on these individual boxes. So that's direct control. What we found with some customers is that wasn't enough. It wasn't just enough to say you have access to these boxes but not to these other ones. The second thing that we have is something called direct authorize. Direct authorize allows me to define in Active Directory certain job roles of functions. So I can say that I have a set of database administrators, OS administrators, backup operators, and so forth, and then I can assign specific rights to them. And those rights are, what method can he log in to the machine as? Only OpenSSH or the interactive graphical GUI? And we can define what time of day that or time of week or month that they're allowed to actually perform their duties. Even the specific commands that they're allowed to run on the machine. And those individual commands can be like a whitelist that relates to the job function that they have. Yeah. So that's direct authorize, and we found a good adoption on that, and it rides right on top of the direct control feature set. So you're not installing different agents and different architectures for it. And since all the data is managed in Active Directory, I don't have any third-party infrastructure I have to manage in order to get those features and functions.
Right, and I know we're not talking about this necessarily packaging, but that's something that's included with direct control when I acquire direct control?
Yeah, so what we sell is we sell something called the Centrify suite, and the suite provides the capabilities for access control, authorization, and audit, depending on which version of the suite. Yeah. And that's actually the third piece, which is, okay, great, now you can control who has access. You can control when and how and what they can do on those boxes. But many of these regulations require us to go a step further. And that's actually to be able to recreate what those users did and tie back not just what happened on the box, but who actually performed those activities. In essence, I want to be able to tie back a user session to the individual user itself. So we have another product called Direct Audit, which is able to record the individual administrative sessions on these servers, store it back in an SQL database, and then we can actually report based on a user's identity in Active Directory what sessions they've had, what they've done. We can search by command, by time, by user, by machine, and that gives you a nice comprehensive replay of what they did. It's kind of like a DVR for these systems, but with a lot more information that makes it searchable and reportable.
So Corey, you mentioned the Linux operating systems. What flavors of Linux are you supporting today on the Z-Series platform?
That's a great question. IBM has themselves validated a couple flavors of Linux. Primarily it's SUSE Linux from Novell and Red Hat, and a couple of versions, the most two recent versions of each of those. Okay. We currently support SUSE 10 and are going to be supporting 11 here soon. We also support Red Hat 5, and we'll be supporting additional flavors as they come out. One of the interesting things I would point out is that IBM actually provides a pretty good validation certification program that tests the binary compatibility with these different Linux flavors and actually provides a ready for Linux on IBM systems logo. And so we've achieved that logo. And because we've done the certification and we actually have customers in production with this product or testing and using the product as well, we've actually been able to attain the IBM Advanced level partnership as well. So we're working closely with IBM in both the validation as well as actually marketing to the customer base these capabilities.
Great. I was going to ask you about customers. Is there anything else that is worth sharing with the audience today about?
Maybe a quick customer example.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, we do have a large Wall Street financial services and trading organization. One of the larger ones actually has built much of their data center using the cheap Intel hardware. And they have literally over 1,500 systems that they're having to manage, and they were managing through the Centrify technology for access control and for authorization and audit. They ran into a challenge of they just ran out of space in their data center, and they needed to look at either building a new data center, which would have cost in the tens of millions of dollars, or making better use of the real estate and power that they were already allocated. They couldn't get any more power, they couldn't get any more floor space. So they worked with IBM and actually validated that the Series Z would be a good option for them to reduce not only their management and cooling and real estate and electricity issues, but also to provide them some of the robust features related to dynamic allocation of resources and high availability and just the IBM brand name, that the security that provides. But a key for them is that they didn't want to actually commit to that platform unless Centrify was on board with helping them to manage those environments, because they knew that they were going to go from those 1,400 systems to potentially many thousands as they continue to build their business as well as optimize how they manage these individual Linux environments. So we're excited about that. We're also working with some travel and insurance companies, and we've got several other of our existing customers and new prospects looking at this as well. So we would encourage anyone who knows that they are implementing Series Z in their environment to look to see whether or not there are Linux images that are going to be deployed on it, and then to start to ask the questions, how are we going to manage the access control and provide users access to those systems?
Well, that was going to be one of my last questions, just a set of kind of best practices or things to consider if I'm looking at solutions like this. Things that you mentioned around whitelisting, for example, not sharing usernames and passwords. Are there other best practices in that vein that you found in working with customers on that?
Well, many people are excited about the benefits of virtualization in terms of the efficiencies and the power and the flexibility it provides them. And they're starting to they're allowing the security and regulatory compliance type of policies to kind of be not considered. Well, there's a reason those policies are in place, is to avoid insider threats, is to avoid accidental destruction of data. It's even to avoid the typical hacker or somebody trying to steal credit card information, although that's not the only challenge that those security regulations provide. They're best practices for a reason. And if you look, in addition to the fact that virtualization is allowing this sort of lax enforcement environment to creep in, you also have to consider just the heterogeneity of your enterprise. Our market research tells us that there's many, the majority of enterprise organizations have many different types of Unix and Linux and different processor types, different virtual environments. And it's got to be very inefficient to be managing those systems on an individual technology basis. And so we provide, I think, some best practices around one common skill set to manage access to many different machines. One of our largest customers and one of the larger retailers in the world is able to manage literally many thousands, over 10,000 images and machines, both Unix and Linux, using only a handful, a few dozen administrators. And the reason they can do that is they have one common way of managing access to all those systems, configuring them, actually controlling what people can do on them. So we have many customer examples in all the major verticals. We'd love to share some of those examples with our customers on an individual basis.
Good stuff. Thanks, Corey.
No problem. We really enjoy putting these Chalk Talks together. I hope they're useful for people, and we really look forward to the conversations that might spin out of these Chalk Talks.
So again, I'm Frank Cabri alongside Corey Williams. Thanks for joining us for another Centrify Chalk Talk today, and we invite you to check out some other Chalk Talks we've done on the VMware ESX platform as well as the Solaris OS platform. Thanks again.